Okay, where did we leave off? We finished with Terror of Mechagodzilla, and that was from 1975. Where I ended up picking up the franchise here is when we get to the next era of these films, and that's the Heisei era. This film, Return of Godzilla from 1984, I remember it not as this. I remember it as Godzilla 1985, which was a sort of an American remix or re-edit of this Japanese version. And, that one also brought back Raymond Burr as Steve Martin from the American version of the original film, kind of picked up his story and brought him back into the fold. The thing is, going back to this one, Return of Godzilla, it's also clear that this is a direct sequel to the original film. This is 30 years after, right? And I feel like it's not the first time I've seen that, of course. We've seen a lot of sequels over the years that have done that. But here, to skip basically so many films, to disregard pretty much all of the 60s and 70s and go straight into this, it's a pretty bold move, But at the same time, I feel like maybe it was worth it because this film at least does have something that's kind of more significant to talk about. A part of this is also the element of making Godzilla scary again, making this idea of this giant monster just terrifying. But also the commentary on the state of things, the state of the world, whether it's tensions between the U.S. and Russia. And then ultimately in the plot of this film, the idea, the thought of using nuclear weapons on Japan. That's something that nobody wants to do. I feel like for the time, it was a pretty solid effort, At this point today, it doesn't really hold up because it's not necessarily the state of the world that we're in. We've got some other things going on, of course, but the Cold War isn't what it was. And the dynamic between the US, between Russia, between Japan, all these things are somewhat different now. So I feel like this really capitalized on things that were happening in the world at that time. And if you were around for that time, of course, that makes sense, and I think it works. But if you're watching this without any concept or memory of what the Cold War was, I could feel like this just seems a little strange. But I'll say that the Godzilla 1985 version was probably my first real Godzilla film that I saw as a kid. Going back and watching this version now, just like with the original, going back and watching the actual Japanese version, I see some different things. And I guess because I'm also older now, I can understand a little deeper. And I think the other thing that strikes me is that this one feels like, of all the films up to this point, this feels like the most modern. There's something about the style, the choices of the way it's filmed, some of the special effects, some of the editing. It feels more modern. It feels like the language of film that we still understand today versus a lot of the earlier films they still feel like the way they made films back in the 60s and even in the 70s. This one feels more grounded, more, I don't know if gritty is the word, but it just feels a little more authentic. Of course, it's still got a giant monster roaming around the city and all this, but it's at least more contemporary, I think. It doesn't feel so weird and fantastical and goofy. It feels like a little more return to a serious subject matter. This has kind of always been where my dial is set for Godzilla, right in this area. So once I decided, all right, let me go through this whole era, turns out some of these films are a little hard to find. So I had to kind of skip a few. There's a couple that I did want to watch, but the next one I did get to was Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla. And here, after everything I just said about Return of Godzilla, this franchise again takes a turn into Weirdsville, because now we've got a piece of Godzilla that has been lost in space and is mutated into some other weird space Godzilla. We've got the humans that build a new manned robot called Mothra, which, at first I thought, well, wasn't that Mechagodzilla? But that's not what Mechagodzilla was, of course. This is, in a way, maybe even a little bit of an early inspiration for something like Pacific Rim. Of course, there have been other films and other stories where people are in giant robots. Of course, anime, that's like a big element of so much of that world. But in the Godzilla kaiju genre, I think this one was maybe the first step, or at least the first one that I can think of. So this one, even though it gets a little weird and it starts to get off into left field again, I think for its time, it's doing a lot to show off the special effects here. I mean, there are several fights and action scenes and all that. There's even a little Godzilla, which looks actually more cute than weird. I'll give you a couple of points for that, even though I still don't know why we have a little Godzilla anyway. But there's this showdown at the end of the film, as with most of these films, or pretty much all of them really, with Godzilla, with Mothra, and with SpaceGodzilla. This has got to be like the most explosive one yet. I mean, there's so much like pyrotechnics and stunts and just so much going on. And the fact that these films still hold to this method of doing all of this in camera, really, up until this point at least. I mean, there's a few like enhancements and whatever, but we haven't gotten into the era of CG. We haven't even really gotten to the era of like optical visual effects that are coming in and sort of augmenting things. There's a little bit happening, but for the most part, a lot of this stuff is still being done in camera and it's real. And it's, of course, it's miniatures and it's a guy in a rubber suit and it's a couple of guys in a rubber suit, but then there's a lot of explosions, a lot of lighting effects. It just gets really crazy. And this film, I think, is the one that really, man, that last final fight scene is wild. The important thing to keep in mind here is that this Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla, this is 1994. Now, a few years later, we get the first American version of Godzilla, which, that, I remember when that came out, and I remember that being a big deal. Even though I didn't have any of this context with the Godzilla franchise, I just knew that Godzilla is a thing, and it's a Japanese thing, so to do an American version, oh, what is that going to be like? And I feel like there was a lot of hype around it. I feel like, it did well at the box office, but I think for most people, it was just weird. And considering it came on the heels of something like Jurassic Park, and it even kind of cribbed some ideas, I think, from it. I don't know. Not only that, but I think the story and even some of the performances in that version, they don't really hold up, even if they ever worked in the first place. So I said, okay, let me at least move on to another era here. We get into the Millennium era with Godzilla 2000. That's in 1999. And this is where we start to see the introduction, the integration of more modern visual effects. But the problem is, this is 1999. And some of this stuff, if you're not doing it right, if you're not doing it at a high level, it's crude, it's bad, right? I mean, 1999, that's the same year The Matrix came out. And that, for the most part, I think, was the top tier of visual effects at the time. It stands out because it did so much and how well it did it, right? But you get something like this, which, you think Godzilla, it's a long-running franchise. There's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of potential audience investment in this. So let's do this at the top tier. And this film just is not there. The idea of bringing Godzilla up into the 21st century, updating the designs, updating the whole concept. I feel like there's something to that. But the problem is it still relied on a lot of the old tricks. And even to the point where we're still seeing some sort of alien, otherworldly being or entity involved in this. And I feel like we went down that road already. We had the weird Japanese aliens that just wear cool sunglasses. And we had the other aliens that brought Godzilla. And then we had, I don't even know anymore. There's just too many aliens that are just people in weird costumes, right? Here, at least, we're trying to do something that is an alien, but also it's its own creature. But why can't we just get back to Godzilla? You know, if we're going to update this whole concept, let's simplify it. Let's get simple with it and streamline it. I'll say we do have a couple of interesting storylines in this that aren't so cookie cutter. We've got a little more of like an outsider point of view from some of this. We've got a young woman who's a journalist. We've got of course, the government. We've got the scientists. And there's just a little bit different dynamic here. But of course, a big part of this is still the monsters. And to know that this was really done more as a reaction to the American version, that's not really the right motivation to make a movie like this. I mean, you should make a movie like this because you have something to say and you have a real point you want to make with it. To say, well, okay, that American version, we're going to kind of disown that. We're going to ignore that. And we're going to keep moving with our own original franchise and then turn out something like this. I think that was the wrong idea, you know? And look, I even say this much. This film and Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla, I'm sure a lot of these films, these more recent films, these are not available in the Criterion Channel collection that I talked about in the last episode. So a lot of these I ended up finding on Pluto, which is a streaming ad-supported service. They have their own Godzilla channel. So they run Godzilla movies or kaiju movies all day, every day. So some of these films are there, right? And you're able to watch them. Now, of course, you have ads, which is kind of annoying, and which also reminds me of the value of the Criterion Channel. But some of these films, they're only available there in the dubbed version. And man, the dubs hurt these films. They already have some things not going their way because of, you know, they're kind of antiquated or the special effects aren't so great or, you know, of course it's still giant weird monsters. But then to have some really, really bad dubbing going on, it doesn't help it. It actually distracts and kind of makes it annoying to watch. Give me the original version. I'll read the film. That's fine. Because I feel like there's so much that is introduced or kind of lost in translation that either wasn't necessary or it's just, it's a barrier. It's putting up a problem in front of me that's making it harder for me to really get into this film. And this one was probably the one where I noticed it the most, or noticed it first, where I really had to kind of take my time, be patient with it, and just kind of get through the film. I'll give it this, though. It does have a really cool moment at the end. And if you've seen this, you know what I'm talking about. But it's the moment when Mitsuo, who is kind of the one who wants to kill Godzilla, basically, and he knows he can do it. Well, it turns out at the end, of course, Godzilla can't be killed. So he's the one that is kind of like standing up face to face in a sense. And he kind of gives a defiant Godzilla! I remember seeing that, I don't know, in a trailer or maybe it was in a meme or something, but that moment still, I mean, it works in its own way because it's kind of just gonzo, but at the same time, it means something in the film. It's like a real defiant moment. And Godzilla is having none of that, of course. I didn't even know it was from this film. I was happy to see that. The next one, let me see. This is probably the longest title ever. Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack from 2001. And what I've learned is fans, the people who love these films, they basically refer to it as GMK because forget all that name. too much, right? And here, this film, while I thought it was a sequel to Godzilla 2000, it feels like it's a little bit of a reboot, really. Like we're kind of going back to the original film. You know, there's an element of that with a lot of these films, and I'll talk about that more, but there's an element that it confuses me when I see characters in these films that sort of don't know what Godzilla is. Like, you live in a world where Godzilla is a known thing. It's kind of like the thing where if you watch a movie where, like a zombie movie, and the characters are going through that process of trying to piece together, like, wait, what are these things? Or like vampires. It's like, wait, you drink blood? What? It's like, come on, man. We know what these things are. This story takes place in our world. That means people in our world know what these things are. How many times do we have to see characters reintroduce and come to the conclusion of like, oh, this is a giant monster and its name is Godzilla? Like, come on, I'm done with that. I'm tired of that. Here we have a little bit of that happening, but it's a different thing in a sense, because it's not necessarily a reboot entirely, but it is a thing where some of the characters here, they're going through that process of kind of rediscovering, like this idea of Godzilla, the history of it from the original film, let's say, was somehow lost or forgotten. And these characters are having to figure out, like, wait, what happened? Now, I don't know how the world could forget Godzilla happened, but all right. You know, the idea in the original film was that it was kind of contained. It took place in this small little fishing village in Japan. And even when it kind of got outside of that, we never saw the world's reaction to it. So you could maybe assume like the nation of Japan just decided to kind of keep this under wraps in a sense, right? 1954, the world was very different. News didn't travel like it did. The world didn't move as fast as it did. Maybe that could be possible. Here we have a whole new world, a more contemporary society where they're having to piece this together, and it's also bringing up memories and reminders of losses from the past. You know, that trauma. And so here, I was like, wait, okay, this is actually doing something different. It's not just introducing a new monster. It's not dealing with aliens. It's actually dealing with the human element of how this like generational trauma can live on, or it can be repressed or forgotten. And then once it does come to the surface, how do you deal with it? You know? And okay, now aside from that, when Godzilla does show up, like this is where, to go back to what I said earlier about Return of Godzilla, this is where I see Godzilla. The creature we get in this film is a total badass. I mean, it's just Godzilla on a rampage. And to the point where, I mean, he's like mean. He's got like a brutal, like a cruel streak to him, especially when it comes to the human characters, because it's just like, you're just ants to me. Get out of the way. Right? And that's the thing where, you know, to see Godzilla in some of the previous films, especially the earlier ones, where it kind of gets weird and gets corny, and Godzilla is kind of a friend or some kind of protector. I get the idea there. I get the intent, but I think for all of human history, there is no point in time where we would ever look at 100-foot creature like that and think, oh, this is cool. This is all right. Never would people assume, oh, this is safe to be here. I think the only just instinctive reaction is to be like, get the hell out of here. This thing is going to kill everybody. And here is where we're reminded of that. And of course, look, Mothra comes back into the fold. Ghidorah comes back into the fold. And we even have a little bit of what I think is an inspiration for what we see later in another film, where we have a commander who's in this submarine, and he decides to basically go straight for Godzilla and take him out. And it kind of works in a sense, right? And of course, there's a little bit of a reveal at the end or whatever, but I feel like some of that, there's some elements of it. Of course, there's even the element of when Godzilla first uses his atomic breath, he actually leaves a mushroom cloud behind. I feel like some of that must have been what worked into -1, which we'll see later. Now, all that said, I feel like that was a pretty positive outcome, right? I think that kind of took things in a much better direction, kind of on an upward trajectory, right? And we get to Godzilla Final Wars in 2004. And I got to say, this whole franchise is like a roller coaster, you know? Because I feel like we were like a little bit on an upward tack there. And now all of a sudden this comes. And I guess there are people who are fans of this film. But to me, it feels like maybe one of the worst modern attempts to take on this franchise. So one, it's a reboot, right? It really kind of stops or ignores everything from the franchise and in the plot of this film, all the other kaiju around the world, which somehow we've, of course, never been introduced to. If we go by the new canon here, they start to awaken, they start attacking all over the world. And turns out it's these aliens with the cool sunglasses. They're back. And they've been in the Matrix the whole time because they dress in all leather and like trench coats and cool haircuts and all that. And I mean, it feels so derivative. It feels like this is Godzilla not doing Godzilla now. This is Godzilla doing somebody else's franchise. There's so much of this film that feels like it's lifted out of, I don't know, let's say the world of the Matrix. But of course, you could say that that was inspired by anime and other action films and science fiction. So in this film, it just feels like it's all focused on style, is not really focused on giving us any interesting characters or any themes that really resonate. You know, the one thing I'll give it, because I really, really didn't like this film. Just like I said about Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla and how that was probably the most spectacular kind of showdown, right, at the end of that film. This one takes it up a notch, okay? So it is a lot of still the guys in the suits and a lot of explosions and a lot of miniatures and all that, but then it does some actually pretty good work with enhancing that with visual effects, right? Now, there is some other stuff in other parts of the film that just don't really work. And they feel like a lot of late 90s visual effects techniques. But here, especially this main showdown at the end with all these creatures, it feels big. It feels spectacular, right? And I think if the idea was to kind of end this franchise with this film, which by the name of the film itself, it seems like that might have been a possibility. Like here, 50 years later, we're going to call it quits on Godzilla. We're out. Everybody's going down, right? I feel like, okay, well, that was a proper showdown for that kind of thing. Like they really went out with just the biggest bang possible. And I think if we would have left it there, I feel like as a Godzilla fan, I don't know that that's really the best send-off. Because I think there was a lot more that could be said or could have been done. That wasn't just retreading the same old ground, which these films I've seen now. I've seen the pattern at least, even though I haven't seen all of these films yet. I've been able to see the pattern of like, okay, well, we just have these same creatures. They keep showing up. They have a little tussle with Godzilla. And then we come back around to it a few years later. It just gets boring. It gets tired, you know? And I think from what we see with what happens in the Reiwa era, which is what comes next, I think we see a group or a class of filmmakers that feel the same way. Because not only do we not get these same creatures coming back, but we really get a whole new look at this idea, not even the creature, but the idea itself. So with that, I mean, we'll go into, well, before I get into the next Godzilla film, I got to talk about Godzilla 2014, which is the American remake, essentially, by Gareth Edwards. And, you know, I talked in the last episode about some other films that have come along that have kind of taken on the same genre. You know, I talked about Cloverfield, talked about Pacific Rim a little bit. I even mentioned Transformers, which it's kind of adjacent, you know, it's close enough, I guess. And whether or not those have really been successful, but one that I left out, and I wanted to wait until I talked about this, Godzilla from 2014, was a film called Monsters. And that was a film that Gareth Edwards did in 2000, I think it was like 2011, 2010 or 2011. And I remember watching that and thinking, oh, wait, here's somebody, I gotta know what comes next, because this is a whole new take on this genre. The title of the film is Monsters. You expect to see lots or weird or terrifying monsters, and we really don't get that. We get a couple of monsters, and they're not scary, and we don't get them very much. And yet the monsters that the title was referring to isn't necessarily those creatures, right? Now, that to me is a smart way to do a film like this. And I know there's a lot of people who didn't like the film. They thought it was boring. They thought it's misleading. Like, this is not even what a monster movie is. All right, fine. But I think you're missing the point. And so when I saw that, I was down 100%. But then to see Gareth Edwards come up and do a full-on Godzilla remake, and not only like, oh, the first American remake, but the second, because the first one didn't really work out so well, right? Okay, what is this going to be? Because it's going to have to be good this time. You can't screw this up like last time. And for me, I think there's a lot of great things in that 2014 American version. There are only a couple problems with it in terms of the cast and in terms of some of the story elements. But I feel like it's pretty solid overall. I know some people complain about, hey, Godzilla's not really in this movie that much, or he's in the dark a lot, or you can't really see him, and what are these other creatures? I think the thing that hurt the film was that it tried to take a very decidedly American point of view on this creature. And this is not an American phenomenon, let's say. By having Bryan Cranston, who at first seems like is going to be our main character, I was like, well, okay, I'm in. I want to know what this is going to be about. But then to see like he dies within like, I don't know, in the first act, that's a real disappointment, because then it turns out the main character is his son, Aaron Taylor Johnson, who, you know, is sometimes good, sometimes okay. But in this film, I just feel like this is not who I thought was carrying this film. And even like the logic behind him being the main character, I don't know, it doesn't really seem so put together. Like he just happens to be there versus someone who is actively trying to be involved in this situation, who I really think should have been the main character and secretly really is the main character, is Ken Watanabe. You know, his character is the one that is tied to the phenomena, tied to the history, tied to the science of it, of understanding this creature or these creatures in the film, and doesn't look at them as menaces necessarily, doesn't look at them as destructive, looks at them as creatures, as animals in a sense, and is trying to understand them, but also recognizes like, but this is actually very bad for civilization to let these things go crazy. And that's the real conflict. I feel like that's the real heart of the film right there, is his character, Serizawa. And put it this way, I think that point was reinforced when the sequel comes out, Godzilla King of Monsters, which was it like 2019 or something like that? And he's one of the only carryover characters from that first film. And put it this way, he even has the real sacrifice. He has the full arc in those two movies. And I just feel like it's unfortunate that he kind of doesn't feel like the main character in the first movie, because I think he really is. And so with that, we get the beginning of the legendary Monsterverse, which starts with Godzilla. Then we get Godzilla, King of Monsters, and we get Kong, Skull Island, and then we get the more recent films. And there's a TV show now, and then apparently there's going to be another film. You know, we're off on a new track now, right? And yet Toho is still figuring out what to do, because their last film is kind of rough, and it's from 2004. And so when we finally get to 2016, we get Shin Godzilla, which I got to say, this one was a swing, and this one went way out in left field, you know? And I feel like there's some good ideas in here, especially the idea of seeing the evolution of this creature, which is disturbing and strange and kind of horrifying. I think the thing that doesn't work in this film is the human element. And I get it. It's a little bit of a commentary on the Japanese government, maybe the sort of response and actually maybe incompetence to everything that happened in 2011, which was when there was an earthquake, the tsunami, the Fukushima disaster there. And there's so much that I feel like there's a couple of layers that the film is working on. And the main thing, of course, is that now Godzilla is scary again. And like this time, not even really a character. It's just an animal. It's just some weird, strange, oblivious creature that has no regard for anything and is just doing whatever it really needs to do. It's growing. It's evolving. It's got no time to pay attention to people. And here is also where we get the first real full CG version of this character, this creature, and all of the visual effects, all of the action. It's pretty convincing at this point. Like, we've really left behind the days of working with miniatures and working with people in suits and really bad, 70s and 80s visual effects. Like, we've really moved up to the 21st century now. This thing looks legit. I think the thing that hurts this film, at least for me, is so much of the human characters. And it's not even the characters themselves and their dilemma and what they're trying to do. It's just the way it's presented. I can see it. It's kind of taking jabs at bureaucracy and taking jabs at government and indecisiveness and lack of urgency, all of those things, right? But the way these characters come off, and the first hour of this film is mostly just a bunch of characters in rooms, in meetings, talking quickly. I read somewhere that, maybe the inspiration was something like a Aaron Sorkin kind of Social Network vibe, where like the characters, they have a lot to say, they have a lot to do, and they just talk fast and they go fast and they can't stop because they can't think about that because there's a giant creature outside. The problem is it's delivered in it's like every shot, every cut to another character saying something, it's the exact same rhythm. It's the exact same pattern. And after you do that cut like 4 or 5 times in a scene, and everybody talks the same way and they say the same words in the same exact rhythm like this, and then they say the next same words in the same exact rhythm just like this, and then they say it again, and then there's a different character, but then they say it another way, but they're still actually saying the same thing just like this. I mean, that goes on for like an hour. It feels like. And it gets exhausting. And especially when you're reading it, it's not like I'm actually understanding the words. I'm having to read all that so fast. And I can't even really pay attention to any nuance. And so I think I get what they were going for. I just don't know if it really works. But I think the places where this film really does work is in the depiction of Godzilla. And not to mention, this is also another reboot. This is entirely starting over. It did catch me for a minute because, like, for the first 20, 30 minutes, as we see the first appearance of the creature and we see people's initial reaction to it, I really did go through that, like, internal question with myself of, wait, how do people not know this is Godzilla? Like, obviously, this is Godzilla, right? And then I realized, oh, wait, okay, in this film, in this world, people don't know what this is. We're starting all over. Forget any of the other films. Forget 1954. We're starting all over. And, that's where it kind of started to frustrate me in terms of how many times are we going to redo this, And I'd already felt that in previous films. But this one, I think because it wants to move at such a fast pace, especially when we just see the people and their scenes, like, you expect there to be a little more of, like, let's come to this conclusion a little faster. And I guess that's the idea, of course, is that we're showing these people who can't find their way out of a paper bag, right? But I don't know. I don't know how I really feel about it in the bigger sense. I just think it's done some great things to advance the depiction of the creature. And I think the thing where it was lacking was in the human element of it, though. Like, you got to really make me care about these people or the world that they live in and not see Godzilla just totally tear it apart, right? And I think that's where we get to, finally, Godzilla -1 in 2023, which, again, is another reboot because we're going back before 1954 now. We're going back to the end of World War II, right? So we start with 1945. I think it goes up to 1947. We're dealing with a kamikaze pilot, Shoichi, who kind of doesn't do the kamikaze thing, Like, he makes a different decision. And here's where I think we really find our human element. We find somebody to connect to, somebody who had a purpose, but they abandoned that purpose. They chose something else. And then that landed them square in the middle of desolation because Japan, after World War II, was a mess. And it was hobbled. And it was just devastated. And so we're seeing him come back to his country, come back home to a place that he doesn't really recognize and has to basically start life from scratch again. And he ends up finding a woman, Noriko, and a baby, Akiko, who they kind of form a makeshift family in a sense. They were camped out by his house, and he essentially takes them on as a surrogate wife and child. And there's something about that approach to telling the story. Is like, you just keep it small. Keep it about one person. Keep it about his struggle, about his trauma, about his grief, and how he has to work through those things. And when we finally start to get around to, like, oh, here's a bigger problem out there. When he takes a job, he's working on a boat. He's trying to clean up mines that have been left in the ocean. And that's what really leads to the full encounter with Godzilla. And I got to say, I mean, the way that it's rendered here is similar to Shin Godzilla, where this is a creature just doing its thing. And at the same time, it's absolutely terrifying. Because what is this? And even to the point where we get the attack on Ginza, and basically everything in the second half of the film where Godzilla is involved, it's a nightmare. I mean, it's just devastating. And we get to see Shoichi finally do something to redeem himself or to find purpose and find value again in his own life by taking on Godzilla, right? And you think, well, okay, what's one man going to do? But this plot, the way it's constructed, the way these characters, they're drawn out, it works. You feel connected to these people and you feel like you want them to succeed, not only because there's the giant monster thing, but also you want them to succeed for themselves. And so I think, look, by all accounts, up to this point, everything I've seen, or even you just look at the ratings in IMDb, I think this is probably the best Godzilla film to date. I mean, it even won an Academy Award. And that's no small feat, okay? I mean, this is a pretty small production in terms of the budget, in terms of the level of the team involved. You know, this isn't a Marvel movie. This isn't a James Cameron movie, right? This is a very small film. And it's actually really telling a very small story. It just happens to have a big, giant creature in the middle of it. I hope that there's a way to continue this approach to telling these stories about Godzilla, because I think these really work. You know, the last one that I saw, because it's the most recent, is Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire. And I don't really feel like it's a Godzilla film. I kind of don't even know why Godzilla's in the film. There are some parts of the film, there are some scenes that Godzilla is involved in, but it's not really a Godzilla film. It is pretty much through and through a King Kong film, or Kong, or whatever. And not only that, but I don't feel like it's really done to the same level as the previous three films. I think part of the problem with these films is the cast. And it's not that the casting's bad necessarily, but I just feel like, couldn't we have tried a couple of other things? Couldn't we maybe just done a couple more takes, you know? I mean, especially in this film, I feel like, what's his name? Brian Tyree Henry? Is that his name? I probably messed it up. But his character in these films is such an annoying presence that I kind of just want to tune out whenever he talks. I'll say this much. I mean, I guess this was an entry into the canon, at least, for exploring more of the, what's it called? The Hollow Earth concept, right? Because that's never, as far as I can remember now, it's never been a thing in any of the original Godzilla films. I don't really know where it came from. I don't know if it's Godzilla films or maybe King Kong. I don't think it's ever been in a King Kong film before Skull Island. I just don't feel like I buy that to begin with. So that makes these films super hard to really feel connected to. Okay, you're just doing magic now, right? We can just travel into the earth, into another dimension or realm or something. So I'll say this. I mean, supposedly it's the biggest legendary film with Godzilla in it. And apparently that warrants a third film in that series of Godzilla and Kong. I don't know what that could possibly be. I don't know if that means maybe a new creature. I would actually just prefer a return to one or the other, right? Just give me another Godzilla film or just give me another Kong film, but I don't know if I need this matchup and trying to force something to happen. I'm kind of okay without that. But otherwise, you know, the other thing I wanted to comment on here for a second is the amount of problems I had with the continuity. You know, look, you watch enough films, you see enough franchises and long-running characters, you get a sense of like, all right, well, you're not going to have great continuity every time. And a lot of times you're not going to have any continuity. You know, the one that I feel like is probably still trying so hard to make it work is the Terminator franchise. And I feel like they really kind of lost that whole thing after the third one. The first three films, I feel like we're in the same universe. We're in the same timeline or whatever you want to say. But once we get after that, who knows? It's anybody's guess, really. And I feel like Dark Fate maybe kind of tried to get us back there, but I don't know. You know, another one that I mentioned it before, but the James Bond franchise. That's one that for all the films that Sean Connery was James Bond, it made sense. We had a single continuity, really. As soon as he left the franchise, well, is this the same character? Is this just a different version of the character? And it really just went like that. It was just a weird roller coaster all through, the 80s and 90s until we get to Daniel Craig. And Daniel Craig, his James Bond, is the first one that's like, nope, this is a single character. We're going to play out his entire arc in these films. And it turned out to be, 5 films, I think? And by the time we get to that last film, it feels concluded, right? But the problem is we have all the other films that came before that, and they are part of the franchise. It's not like we forgot them all. And they weren't like disavowed or denounced or whatever. Like they are still part of the James Bond empire. You know, we have other like horror franchises. They're probably the worst at this. You have something like Halloween, which has had not only its original and all of the sequels that came after it, but then you have H2O, which kind of disregards all the sequels and goes back to the first film. Then you have the Rob Zombie remake, which disregards all of the previous films, including the original. And then it has a sequel. And then you have the 2018 remake, which disregards, of course, the Rob Zombie remake and its sequel, and disregards all of the Halloween films except for the very first one. Yo, what? And then it had 2 sequels, which totally went off the rails. Whether it's Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just a mess. They've all kind of done the same thing. And I feel like, of course, part of it is like, look, we're trying to leverage this property, all right? We're trying to make some more money. We're not necessarily trying to tell any new stories, I guess. But here with Godzilla, I felt like you see the pattern of like, okay, well, we're just kind of reintroducing this character over and over, and we somehow introducing these same exact creatures or villains or opponents or whatever. And only with the more recent films have we seen something different. Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, not only do they entirely reboot the thing, they basically are a one-off film, but they go in entirely different directions. And, you know, maybe that's the idea is, hey, you know what? Let everybody just take a stab at telling this story brand new. Now, of course, that's going to get old. Like, I don't need to see the origin story every time. I mean, we've already gotten tired of doing that with all the superheroes. We don't need to see Spider-Man get bit by the spider again. We don't need to see Superman come to Earth. You know, it's just like there's only so much of that we need to see before we get it. Develop this character now. Don't just tell us how he started. Tell us where he's going. And so what does that mean for this now? For Godzilla as a franchise? I don't know. I kind of would like to see a sequel to -1. And it's not really a thing where you could say, okay, well, the sequel to -1 is the 1954 film. Like, that doesn't really line up. So then would a sequel to this be kind of a remake of the original film with modern visual effects, maybe a new approach to the same story, the fishing village and the people who discover it and the scientists and the government's reaction to it? Maybe. It's one possible way to do it. And then kind of restart the franchise entirely from -1 going forward. I feel like this might be the place to do it. And in terms of like the legendary thing, I mean, I don't know. I think they're sold on this whole idea of we got to just have multiple monsters in this all the time. And the problem, of course, you see with, especially with this last one, is you lose the scale. You lose the context by just having monsters in the monster world and no people. You don't really see them as monsters anymore. They're just creatures. They're just animals. And so I feel like, okay, we're off in some other place now because there's no real tension to that. That's just not, it's not the same kind of thrills that I expect out of this kind of a film. So I don't know. I think only the future knows what we'll see out of this. But I feel like -1 is a good place to even leave it. Even if we just said, all right, we're done. Toho, we're shutting down. No more Godzilla movies. We'll see what happens. So, all right, look, I think I ran through enough of these. There are still several films I never got to see, and I'll probably catch up with them one day. I'll do like another episode where I kind of catch all the stragglers, I guess. But in the meantime, man, this has been a weird, fun, kind of frustrating run, but we'll get on to some new things in the next episode. So until then, hey, just have fun, stay away from the scary monsters, and go watch something new.